You ever have one of those nights where you just know something's off, but you can't really put your finger on it? That was us last October. It started like any other night, just me, Jane, and Liam. We had this tradition, you know? Every Halloween, we'd hit up whatever haunted house or event was happening around town. But this time, Liam heard about this special thing in L.A., over at Dollhouse Studios, the place where they shoot all those low-budget horror flicks. I wasn't super into it, but Liam and Jane were all about it, so I caved. It sounded like fun at first, right? The studio transforms into this massive Halloween experience, and you get to walk through these haunted houses based on their horror films. Jane was obsessed with this one movie, Into the Woods, where there's some psycho in a bear mask running around with an axe. Classic slasher stuff. And Liam, well, he just wanted to see if the rumors were true about how real the scares were. You know, the kind where the actors really get in your face and make you think something's wrong. We had planned this for weeks. Pre-ordered tickets, everything. The drive to LA wasn't bad, 2 hours tops. We took turns driving while the others napped, trying to keep the energy up for when we got there. We arrived around 8, paid for parking, and headed straight for the main gate. I remember the air feeling kind of thick that night, like something was hanging in the atmosphere. But it was LA, smog's just a thing there, right? I shrugged it off. The place was packed, like, shoulder-to-shoulder kind of packed. People were dressed up in all sorts of costumes, zombies, clowns, the usual. We were buzzing with excitement, trying to figure out which houses to hit first since there was no way we'd make it through all of them in one night. Jane was set on Into the Woods, Liam wanted to check out Heaven or Hell, and I was all in for Mousetrap, which I'll get to later. The first house, Into the Woods, was exactly what you'd expect, creepy, dimly lit, with trees and fog machines everywhere. They had actors in bear masks swinging axes and chasing us through a fake cabin. Jane was in heaven, hugging her teddy bear, which, by the way, she dressed up like the killer. We laughed it off, but I noticed something strange as we left. One of the actors, this guy in a bear mask, was just standing in the corner, watching us. Not in a scaring us kind of way, but like, really watching us. His mask didn't have the usual fake blood or torn fabric like the others. It looked newer. Cleaner. I thought maybe it was just part of the act, but the way his head tilted, like he was studying us, gave me chills. I nudged Liam and pointed him out, but when he turned, the guy was gone. I thought I was losing it. Liam brushed it off, saying something like, "Dude, they probably rotate actors all night. You're being paranoid." So, we moved on. Next up was Heaven or Hell, which was more of a psychological thing. It started out looking all peaceful and angelic, with golden gates and soft music. But as we walked further, the whole vibe shifted. The music turned darker, the walls looked like they were rotting, and these creepy, distorted angels were crawling on the ground. Liam was into it, but I kept hearing this faint whispering that no one else seemed to notice. It was like a low hum, almost like someone calling my name. I kept looking around, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but no one else seemed to hear it. Every time I asked, Jane just rolled her eyes, and Liam was too busy eyeing one of the female actors. I could have sworn one of those whispers said something like, "You shouldn't have come here," but again, it was probably just my imagination running wild. We got out of that house, and I shook off the unease. This was supposed to be fun, right? So, when it was finally my turn to pick a house, I went with Mousetrap. It's kind of a weird flick, about a girl named Maggie who's kidnapped and forced into a mouse costume. She's trapped in this creepy lighthouse and hunted by a guy in a cat suit. I thought it'd be cool to go through it since I was dressed as Maggie for the night, well, my version of her. Instead of a white mouse costume, I wore a black mask with a leather jacket. Jane and Liam thought it was hilarious, calling me Matty Mouse the whole night. Anyway, the lighthouse set was at the far end of the studio, near this fake town and dock they had built for one of their older movies. By the time we got there, the line was insane, but we lucked out and got in as one of the last groups before they closed the gate behind us. That's when things started feeling really weird. As soon as the door slammed shut, the air in the house changed. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt heavier, like we were sealed inside, cut off from everything outside. And it was too quiet. Usually, these haunted houses have actors jumping out at you right away, but there was nothing. No screams, no footsteps, nothing. Just the sound of our shoes echoing in the dark. I remember Liam joking, "Guess the actors are on break," but there was something in his voice, like he didn't really believe it either. We kept walking, trying to make sense of the layout. Fake walls, old fish hooks hanging from the ceiling, and shadows playing tricks on our eyes. The set was eerily realistic, but not in a good way. It didn't feel like a movie anymore. It felt like something else. Then we heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper, just barely audible over our footsteps. Psst. Over here. We stopped dead in our tracks. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. It sounded like someone was right behind us, but there was no one. Jane grabbed my arm, her nails digging in, and whispered, "What the hell was that?" Liam, trying to act tough, shouted into the darkness, "Hello? Anyone there?" "Shut up, Liam," I hissed. My heart was racing now. I didn't want to admit it, but something was wrong. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Then, we heard it again. A soft voice, closer this time, almost like it was right in our ears. Too late. That's when I knew we weren't alone in that house. We stood there for what felt like forever, staring down the dark hallway, waiting for something to happen, some actor to jump out, some strobe light to flicker on, anything to break the silence. But it didn't. The voice we heard, that low, soft "too late," seemed to seep into the walls. It made my skin crawl. I could feel Jane gripping my arm even tighter, her breath quick and shallow, like she was trying not to panic. Liam, though, he still had that cocky grin on his face, like he thought it was all just part of the experience. "I'm telling you, this has to be some next-level scare tactic," Liam said, his voice echoing through the empty space. "They're probably watching us on some hidden camera, laughing their asses off." I wasn't so sure. There was something off about this place, something that went beyond the usual cheap thrills. I glanced back at the door we came through, half expecting to see it open, or at least hear the distant sounds of the outside world, other guests, cars, anything. But it was dead silent, like the whole world had been swallowed up by the walls of the set. "We should go," I whispered, not wanting to freak out Jane even more, but she was already on edge. "Go where?" Liam shot back, still trying to keep things light. "We just got in. Besides, we're probably halfway through. You don't want to miss the big finale, do you?" I didn't have a good response to that. I mean, he was right, there was no sense in turning back now. But every step forward felt wrong. The further we went into that place, the more disconnected it felt. Like we'd passed through some invisible barrier, and now we were trapped in a space that didn't quite fit with reality. "Fine," I muttered. "Let's just get through this fast." We kept moving, the hallway twisting and turning in ways that didn't seem to make sense. The fake lighthouse walls, the rusty hooks and fishing nets hanging from the ceiling, it all looked so old, so real, like the props had been sitting there for years. But the movie Mousetrap wasn't even that old. Something about the place felt aged. Rotting. The further we walked, the darker it got. The dim lights overhead flickered weakly, barely cutting through the shadows that seemed to pool around our feet. Every creak of the floorboards made us flinch, every gust of cold air made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then, that voice again. Closer now. Too close. "Maggie." I froze. Maggie. The character from Mousetrap. I was dressed as her, remember? So I thought, maybe it was an actor messing with me. But there was something in the voice, something familiar. It wasn't playful. It wasn't taunting like the actors usually are in these haunted houses. It was desperate. "Maggie, help me." I glanced over at Liam and Jane, who had stopped dead in their tracks too. Jane's eyes were wide, darting around like she was trying to find the source of the voice. Liam, for the first time that night, didn't have that smug look on his face. He looked as freaked out as I felt. "Who the hell is that?" Jane whispered, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, we heard something move. Not footsteps, exactly, but a soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. The air suddenly felt thick, heavy, like we were being watched from every corner of the room. "We need to leave," Jane said, her voice cracking. "Now." I was about to agree when Liam, being Liam, took a few steps forward, deeper into the shadows. He was always the brave one, or maybe just reckless. "It's probably just part of the show," he said, though there was less confidence in his voice now. "They're trying to freak us out." "No, Liam," I hissed. "This isn't right. We should have seen someone by now. A guide, a staff member, anyone. It's too quiet." He turned to face me, but before he could say anything, the lights overhead flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. We were plunged into near total darkness, save for the faintest glow from the emergency exit signs far down the hall. And then, movement. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, larger than any human, shifting in the darkness. I could barely make it out, but it was there, slinking across the floor. Liam didn't see it at first, but Jane did. She grabbed his arm and pulled him back, her voice barely more than a panicked whisper. "Liam, please, we have to go." For once, Liam didn't argue. He must have seen something in her face, or maybe he finally sensed that we were way beyond normal now. We turned and started walking faster, back the way we came, only the hallway didn't look the same anymore. The walls were narrower, the floor creaked louder, and there was this smell. Like old, wet wood and something worse. Rot, maybe. It was subtle, but it was there, hanging in the air like it had been waiting for us to notice it. The scraping sound came again, louder this time. "Closer." "Go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We broke into a jog, then a full-on sprint, trying to find the exit. The hallways twisted and turned in ways I couldn't understand. It was like the place was shifting around us. None of it made sense anymore. My chest was tight, heart pounding in my ears, and Jane was barely holding it together, her breath coming out in sharp gasps. Liam stayed ahead of us, his footsteps echoing through the darkness. And then, we hit a dead end. The hallway we'd been running through suddenly stopped, blocked by a solid wall that hadn't been there before. There was no door, no window, nothing. Just a blank, cold wall that looked like it had been there for years. "No way," Liam whispered, running his hands over the surface. "We didn't come this way. This is wrong." Before we could even process what was happening, the lights flickered back on. But they weren't normal lights. They were dim, yellowed, like the bulbs were about to die. And in that sickly light, we saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway we'd just come from. Tall, covered in shadows, but unmistakably watching us. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, as if waiting for something. My throat tightened, and I felt Jane shaking beside me. Liam took a step back, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to move. Now." And then the figure did something that made my blood run cold. It smiled. But not a human smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like it was carved into its face. And that's when I realized it wasn't wearing a mask. It was a face twisted and distorted, with eyes that gleamed like polished glass. And it wasn't alone. From behind it, more shapes began to emerge from the shadows. Silent, still, their faces grinning in that same unnatural way. They were watching us, waiting. And that's when the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Maggie, come home." I felt my stomach drop when I heard that voice again, "Maggie, come home." It was so clear, like it was right behind me. But there was nothing there. Just the figures at the far end of the hall, their grins stretching impossibly wide, frozen in place. My pulse raced in my ears, and the walls seemed to close in on us. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't right. This isn't part of the house." Jane's grip tightened around my arm, her nails digging into my skin. She wasn't screaming anymore, but she didn't have to. The sheer terror in her eyes said it all. She was barely holding it together, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Liam, for once, didn't have anything smart to say. His eyes were fixed on the figures, and I could see his hand twitching, like he wanted to run but didn't know which way to go. Then, the lights above us flickered again, and the figures moved. Not like people, though. It was like watching something glide, almost hovering, closer. Silent. No footsteps, no creaks. Just the quiet hiss of the air shifting around us. I grabbed Liam by the shoulder, forcing him to look at me. "We need to move," I hissed, my voice low but urgent. "Now." He nodded, but his face was pale. "Which way?" "We're cornered." That's when I remembered the wall Jane had knocked down earlier. The one back where Liam had spooked her. It was thin, just a piece of plywood or something. If we could find it again, maybe we could break through, get out of this maze. "This way," I muttered, pulling Jane and Liam back the way we'd come. The figures were still moving, though slower, almost like they were playing with us. They weren't in any hurry. They knew we were trapped. We rushed through the hall, our footsteps pounding on the old wooden floors. Everything looked different now, the walls seemed closer together, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I could still hear that whisper, faint now, but always there. Always calling Maggie, "Come home." Like the walls themselves were repeating it, over and over again. Finally, we reached the place where Jane had knocked down the fake wall. Only, when we got there, the wall wasn't broken anymore. It had been replaced. The opening was gone. "No, no, no," Jane whimpered, her voice cracking as she started to panic. She ran her hands over the wall, desperate to find some kind of crack, something she could push through. But it was solid now, as if it had never been broken at all. Liam started pacing, muttering to himself, his voice shaky. "This doesn't make sense. It was right here. I saw it. We saw it." He punched the wall in frustration, but it didn't budge. "We're losing time," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering in my chest. "There has to be another way." That's when I heard it, footsteps. Not ours. Not those strange gliding sounds from before. These were heavy, deliberate, echoing down the hallway from where we'd just run. The sound was so out of place, so normal. I turned, and my stomach flipped. A figure was coming toward us, but this one was different. It wasn't one of those grinning things. This one walked like a person. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long, dark coat that billowed slightly as it moved. But its face, it was hidden in shadow. No mask, no smile. Just darkness. Like its features had been swallowed up by the shadows around it. "Who's that?" Jane whispered, clutching my arm so tightly it hurt. "I don't know," I muttered, but something about it felt wrong. Even more wrong than the grinning figures. This one was more deliberate. Intentional. Like it was the thing in charge. "Go back," the figure said, its voice low and gravelly. "You're not supposed to be here." It was the first time one of them had spoken directly to us. My brain struggled to make sense of it, to figure out what go back meant. Go back where? We were stuck, trapped. We couldn't even find the exit. Liam, being the idiot he always was when things got tense, took a step forward, raising his hands like he was about to argue with this thing. "Look, man, we're just trying to get out of here. You need to let us." Before he could finish, the figure took another step, faster this time, and the floorboards creaked loudly beneath its feet. Something about the way it moved, too fast, too deliberate, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a guy in a costume. I knew it. We turned corner after corner, trying to outrun whatever was behind us, but the hallways twisted in ways that made no sense. It was like being in a maze, only there was no pattern, no logic. Every turn brought us deeper into the dark, and no matter how fast we ran, those footsteps were always just behind us. Then, just as I was about to lose hope, we found another door. This one was heavy, made of old wood, with rusted metal hinges. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "Do we try it?" Liam asked, out of breath, his hand hovering over the handle. "What other choice do we have?" I gasped, my chest burning from running. Jane just nodded, her face pale, tears streaking down her cheeks. Liam yanked the door open, and we stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The room we entered was dark, so dark I couldn't see a thing at first. But it was quiet. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, we just stood there, catching our breath, the cold air stinging our lungs. I felt my heartbeat slowing down, but my nerves were still on edge, every sound making me jump. Then, out of the darkness, a soft light flickered on. It was dim, coming from an old, rusted lamp in the corner of the room. But it was enough to see where we were and what we were surrounded by. This wasn't a set. It wasn't part of the attraction. The room was filled with old photographs, newspaper clippings, and documents pinned to the walls. Some of the papers were yellowed with age, and many of the photos were of people, ordinary people, like the ones you'd see in any family album. Except, their faces were scratched out, all of them. In red ink, or something worse. "What the hell is this?" Liam muttered, stepping forward, his eyes scanning the walls. These people. Jane moved closer to one of the photos, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch it. "I know her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That's the actress from Mousetrap. The one who played Maggie. The one who disappeared." I felt a lump rise in my throat as I looked at the photo she was pointing to. The woman in the picture, before her face had been scratched out, was dressed in the same costume I was wearing. The same mouse costume. And beneath the photo, written in jagged, scrawling letters, was a single word. Real. Suddenly, the dim light flickered again, and we heard the sound of something moving in the shadows behind us. "Maggie, come home." The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was right behind us. I turned around slowly, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but I couldn't. That voice, was too close now. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real, and it was coming from right behind us. Liam and Jane were frozen, too, their eyes wide with fear. We all knew there was nowhere left to go. The dim light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. For a moment, it went completely dark. And when the light buzzed back on, there it was. A figure, taller than any of us, standing in the far corner. It looked like a person, almost. Dressed in the same tattered, oversized cat costume from Mousetrap, but something about it was wrong. The fabric looked old and decayed, like it had been rotting for years, and the face inside the mask wasn't human, it was hollow, a black void where its eyes should have been. But the thing that sent shivers down my spine was its smile. That same twisted, unnaturally wide grin that we'd seen on the figures earlier. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. Waiting. "Maggie," it said, its voice low and guttural, not at all like the whispers from before. This time, it felt like it was coming from the walls themselves, echoing around us. "Come home." Liam stepped in front of me, like he was going to protect me, but I could see his legs trembling. Jane was crying now, her hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes fixed on the thing in the corner. I didn't know what to do. My brain was screaming to run, but my body wouldn't listen. Every instinct I had told me that this was it, this was the end. Whatever that thing was, it was here for me. "I'm not Maggie," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm not." But the figure in the cat costume didn't care. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, its long claws scraping the floor as it moved. The smile on its face widened, if that was even possible, stretching the fabric of its mask until I thought it would tear. "You've always been Maggie," it hissed. "This is where you belong." "No," I whispered, backing away until I hit the wall. "No, I'm not her. This is just a costume." "It's a costume." Liam grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the door. "We need to go, Maddie. Now." We turned to run, but the door wouldn't open. Liam tugged at it, pulling with all his strength, but it was like the door had been welded shut. We were trapped. And then the light flickered again, and everything changed. The room around us wasn't a storage space anymore. It wasn't even part of the studio. The walls were cold, damp stone, and the floor was uneven, covered in dust and dirt. The photos and papers on the walls were gone, replaced by rusted chains hanging from the ceiling and hooks embedded in the walls. The air smelled like salt water, and I could hear the faint sound of waves crashing against something nearby. We weren't in the studio anymore. We were in the lighthouse. The one from Mousetrap. The one where Maggie had been trapped. "Oh my God," Jane whispered, her voice shaking. "This can't be real. This can't be happening." But it was. I could feel it. The cold, the dampness, the way the shadows moved in the corners of the room, it was all too real. "Maggie, you're home." The voice was louder now, and when I turned around, the figure in the cat costume was right in front of us, its hollow eyes locked on mine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It reached out, its long, twisted claws brushing against my arm, and in that moment, I remembered. I remembered being here before. I remembered the dark room, the chains, the endless days of waiting for the thing in the cat suit to come for me. I remembered being Maggie. "No," I gasped, shaking my head, trying to push the memories away. "No, that's not me. That's not." But the memories kept flooding back, faster now, overwhelming me. I was Maggie. Or at least, I had been. The girl from the movie, the one who was kidnapped, forced into the mouse costume, and hunted by the man in the cat suit. But it wasn't just a movie. It had happened. It had been real. And somehow, I had escaped. But not for long. Liam grabbed me again, pulling me away from the creature, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What's going on, Maddie? What's happening?" "I don't know," I cried, panic rising in my chest. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." Jane was already banging on the walls, searching for any way out, but there was nothing. No doors, no windows. Just stone and darkness. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice soft, almost soothing this time. "You can't run from who you are, Maggie." In that moment, something shifted inside me. The memories, the ones I had been trying to push away, weren't just memories. They were mine. This place, this nightmare, was where I belonged. It was where I had always belonged. "I can't leave," I whispered, the realization sinking in like a weight in my chest. "I never left. I'm still here." "What are you talking about?" Liam shouted, shaking me. "We need to go." But I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. Not now. Not after I remembered. This wasn't just a haunted house. It wasn't just a movie set. It was real. All of it. And then, the final twist hit me. A twist so terrible, I almost couldn't comprehend it. Liam, Jane, and I, we had never left the lighthouse. We had been here the whole time. Trapped. Since the moment we stepped into that house, we were part of it. And now, no matter how hard we tried to escape, we couldn't. We had always been part of the story. I turned to Liam, tears in my eyes, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Before he could respond, the figure in the cat costume lunged forward, its claws sinking into his chest. He screamed, a horrible, guttural sound, as it dragged him back into the shadows. Jane tried to run, but the walls closed in around her, and I heard her scream echo through the darkness. And then there was silence. I was alone. Alone in the lighthouse, just like Maggie. Just like I had always been. The figure stepped out of the shadows, its smile wider than ever, and reached out to me. "Maggie," it whispered. "You're home." I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I finally understood. I had never left. And I never would.